12. There was a warm, damp wind today which lifted large waves on the lake of Gennesaret. Autumn had already come, and the earth smelled of vine leaves and overripe grapes. Men and women had poured out of Capernaum at dawn. The vintage was in its glory. The bunches of grapes, filled with their must, lay waiting on the ground. The young girls, sparkling like the grapes, had eaten whole clusters and smeared their faces with juice. The young men, panting in the full rage of youth, threw furtive glances at the giggling girls who were vintaging. In every vineyard there were shouts and fits of laughter. The girls grew bold and teased the boys, who became more and more heated and drew closer. The sly devil of the vintage ran to and fro, pinching the women and splitting his sides with laughter. Old Zebedee's spacious village house was wide open and buzzing. The wine press on the left side of the yard was being loaded with the contents of brimful hampers, which the young men transported from the vineyards. 4 giants, Philip, Jacob, Peter, and Nathaniel, the village cobbler, a naive camel of a man, were washing their hairy shins and preparing to enter the press to tread the grapes. Every pauper in Capernaum was sure to have his tiny vineyard for the year's supply of wine, and each year he transported his crop to this press, trod the grapes, and took back his share of the must. And old stuff-pocket Zebedee filled his own jars and barrels for the year with the commission he took for use of the press. He sat, therefore, on a raised platform with a long stick and penknife in his hands, and by means of notches marked the number of each person's hampers. But the owners also kept a record in their minds. They did not want to be cheated the day after next at the division of the must. Old Zebedee was a predacious nobody. Trusted him. Everybody had to have eyes in the back of his head. The window of the inner house, which gave onto the yard, was open, and stretched on the divan was old Salome, the mistress of the house. She gazed outside and listened to all that went on in the yard. In this way she forgot the pains which tortured her knees and other joints. She must have been exceedingly beautiful in her youth, slim-boned, tall, with olive skin and large eyes, of a good stock. 3 villages, Capernaum, Magdala, and Bethsaida, had vied for her. 3 suitors had set out at the same time and found her old father, the wealthy shipowner. Each time with a rich train of friends, camels and overflowing hampers, the shrewd old man carefully weighed in his mind the body, soul, and fortune of each, and chose Zebedee, who wed her. She had pleased him, but now the exquisite girl had grown old. Her beauty, eaten by time, had fallen away, and now and then during the important festivals her vigorous, still juicy husband made the rounds at night and played with the widows. Today, however, old Salome's face was aglow. John, her favorite son, had arrived the day before from the holy monastery. He was truly pale and skinny. Prayer and fasting had broken him, but she would keep him near her now, and never let him go away again. She would nourish him with food and drink, and he would grow strong. His cheeks would sparkle once more. God is good, she said to herself, and we worship his grace. Yes, he is good, but he must not want to drink the blood of our children. fasting in moderation, prayer in moderation, that would be fine for both man and God, and they should arrange things in this way, sensibly. She looked anxiously at the door, waiting for John, her baby, to return from the vineyards, where he too was helping to bring in the vintage. In the middle of the yard, beneath the large almond tree, which was heavy with fruit, Judas the Redbeard was bent over, silent, swinging his hammer and fitting iron bands around the wine barrels. If you looked at him from the right, his face was sullen and full of malice. If you looked at him from the left, it was uneasy and sad. Many days had passed since he had fled like a thief from the monastery. During this time he had gone around the villages, fitting up barrels for the new must. He would enter the houses, work, listen to the talk, and register in his mind the words and deeds of each man, in order to inform the brotherhood of everything. But where was the old Redbird? The rowdy, the wrangler? Ever since the day he left the monastery, he had been unrecognizable. "Damn it, Judas Iscariot, open your mouth, devil hare!" Zebedee yelled at him. "What are you thinking about? 2 and 2 make 4. Haven't you realized that yet? Open your mouth, you blessed ruffian, and say something. This is the vintage, no small matter. On a day like this, everyone laughs, even the sullen black sheep." "Don't lead him into temptation, Zebedee," Philip interrupted. "He went to the monastery, it seems. He wants to don the robe. Haven't you heard? When the devil gets old, he becomes a monk." Judas turned and threw a venomous glance at Philip, but did not speak. He detested him. He wasn't a man, no, he was all words and no action, a prattler. At the last minute he'd become paralyzed with fear and had refused to enter the brotherhood. "I have sheep," was his excuse. "I have sheep. How can I leave them?" Old Zebedee burst out laughing and turned to the Redbeard. "Take care, wretch," he shouted at him. "Monasticism is a contagious disease. Look out you don't catch it. My own son escaped by a hair's breadth. My old lady got sick, bless her, and her pet learned about it. He had already finished his schooling in herbs with the abbot, so he came home to doctor her. He won't leave there. He won't leave here again, mark my words. Where to go? He's not insane, is he? There in the desert, there's hunger, thirst, prostrations, and God. Here there's food, wine, women, and God. Everywhere God. So why go look for him in the desert? What's your opinion, Judas Iscariot?" But the Redbeard swung his hammer and did not answer. What could he say to him? Everything came to this filthy dog just as he wanted it. How could he understand the next man's troubles? Even God, who wiped others off the face of the earth for the jump of a flea, flattered and coddled this swine, this parasite, this lickpenny, kept him from suffering the slightest harm, fell over him like a woolen cloak in the winter, like cool linen in the summer. Why? What did he see in him? Was the old bastard devoured with concern for Israel? Why, he wouldn't lift his little finger to help Israel. He loved the Roman criminals because they guarded his wealth. May God protect them, he said, for they maintain order. If not for them, the mob of ruffians and barefooted riffraff would fall all over us, and that would be the last we'd see of our property. But never fear, you old bastard, the hour will come. What God forgets and leaves undone, the zealots, bless them, will remember and do. Patience, Judas, do not breathe a word. Patience. Jehovah's Sabbath day will come. Raising his turquoise eyes, he looked at Zebedee and saw him in the winepress, floating on his back in his own blood. His whole face smiled. By this time the four giants had carefully scrubbed their legs and jumped into the press. Sunk up to their knees, they stamped and trampled the grapes, stooping to pick up whole fistfuls, which they ate, filling their beards with the stems. Sometimes they danced hand in hand, sometimes each screamed and jumped by himself. The smell of the must had made them drunk, and the must was not all. As they looked through the open front door towards the vineyards, they saw the girls bend over to pick the grapes, and their beauty was visible even above the knees, and their breasts, like clusters of grapes, swung back and forth over the vine leaves. The treaders saw them, and their minds grew turbid. This was not a winepress. That was not land and vineyard, but paradise, with old Jehovah Sabaoth sitting on the platform, holding a long stick and a penknife and marking his exact obligation to each. How many hampers of grapes each had brought, and how many jugs of wine. Day after tomorrow, when they died, he would offer them how many jugs of wine, how many cauldrons of food, how many women. On my honor, snapped Peter, if God came this very moment and said to me, "Hey, Peter, my little Peter, I'm in the best of moods today. Ask me a favor, any favor, and I'll do it for you. What do you want?" If he asked me, that I should answer him, "To tread grapes, Lord, to tread grapes for all eternity." "And not to drink the wine, blockhead?" Zebedee rudely asked him. "No, from the bottom of my heart, to tread the grapes." He did not laugh. His face was serious and absorbed. He stopped treading for a moment and stretched in the sun. His upper body was bare, and tattooed over his heart was a large black fish. An artisan, for merely a prisoner, had tapped it on years before with a needle so skillfully that you thought it moved its tail and swam happily, all tangled up in the curly hairs of Peter's chest. Above the fish was a small anchor with 4 crossed arms, each with a barb. But Philip remembered his sheep. He did not like to plow the land, care for the vineyards, or tread grapes. "Good God, Peter," he scoffed, "some job you found yourself, treading grapes for all eternity. I should have asked the Lord to make heaven and earth a green meadow full of goats and sheep. I should then milk them and send the milk flowing down the mountainside. It would run like a river and form lakes on the plain so that the poor could drink. And every night all of us should gather all the shepherds together with God, the chief shepherd. We should light a fire, roast a lamb, and tell stories. That is the meaning of paradise." "A plague on you, moron," grumbled Judas, and he threw another fierce glance at Philip. The adolescents went in and out of the yard, naked, hairy, with a colored rag around their loins. They listened to these disconnected discussions and laughed. They too had a paradise inside them, but they did not confess what it was. They shoveled the hampers into the press, and then, with one bound, were over the threshold and off to rejoin the pretty vintagers. Zebedee parted his lips to add a clever remark, but remained standing with gaping mouth. A strange visitor had appeared at the door and was listening to them. He wore a black goatskin which hung from his neck. His feet were bare, his hair disheveled, and his face yellow like sulphur. His eyes were large, black, and fiery. The feet ceased treading. Zebedee swallowed his witticism, and everyone turned toward the door. Who was this living corpse who stood on the threshold? The laughter came to a standstill. Old Salome appeared at the window, looked, and suddenly cried, "It's Andrew!" "Good God, Andrew!" shouted Zebedee. "Just look at you! Are you returning to us from the underworld? Or maybe you're on your way down there." Peter jumped out of the winepress, clasped his brother's hand without uttering a word, and looked at him with love and fright. Oh, God! Was this Andrew? Andrew, the chubby young hero, the celebrated athlete, first in work and play? Was this the Andrew who had been engaged to flaxen-haired Ruth, the prettiest girl in the village? She had been drowned on the lake, together with her father, one night when God raised a terrible wind, and Andrew had left in despair in order to surrender himself, bound hand and foot to God. Who could tell? He thought, if I join God, perhaps I shall find her with him. Obviously, he was seeking his fiancée, not God. Peter stared at him in terror. He remembered how he had been when he surrendered him to God, and now look how God had returned him to them. "Hey, Zebedee," shouted at Peter. "Are you going to stare at him and finger him all day long? Let him come in. Out there a wind might blow and knock him down. Come in, Andrew, my boy. Bend over, take some grapes and eat. We have bread, too. Glory be to God. Eat and put some color in your cheeks, because if your poor old father sees you in the state you're in, he'll be so scared he'll burrow right back into his shark." But Andrew raised his bony arm. "Aren't you ashamed of yourselves?" he shouted to them all. "Don't you fear God? The world is perishing, and you tread grapes here and laugh. The saints preserve us. Here's another one to give us a hard time," grumbled Zebedee. And now he turned to Andrew in a rage. "You won't leave us alone either, eh? We're stuffed to the gills, if you want to know. Is this what your prophet the Baptist proclaims? Well, you'd better tell him to change his tune. He says the end of the world has come, that the tombs will open, and the dead fly out. He says God will descend, second coming, to open the ledger, and then woe is us. Lies, lies, lies. Don't listen to him, lads. On with our work. Tread the grapes." "Repent! Repent!" bellowed the son of Jonah. He shook himself out of his brother's embrace and stood in the middle of the yard, directly in front of old Zebedee, with his finger lifted toward the sky. "For your own good, Andrew," said Zebedee, "sit down, eat, drink a bit of wine, and come to your senses. Poor thing, hunger has driven you mad." "Easy living has driven you mad, Zebedee," replied the son of Jonah. "But the ground is opening under your feet. The Lord is an earthquake. He'll swallow your winepress and your boats, and you too, you and your confounded belly." He had caught fire, shifted his eyes from side to side. He pinned them now on one, now on the other, and shouted, "Before this must turns to wine, the end of the world will come. Put on hair shirts, spread ashes over your heads, beat your breast, and shout, 'I have sinned, I have sinned.' The earth is a tree. It has grown rotten, and the Messiah is coming with the axe." Judas stopped his hammering. His upper lip had rolled back, and his sharp teeth gleamed in the sunlight. But Zebedee could control himself no longer. "For the love of God, Peter," he shouted, "take him and get him out of here. We've work to do. He's coming, he's coming. Sometimes he holds fire, sometimes a ledger, and now, what next? An axe. Why can't you leave us alone, you impostors, you deceivers of the people? This world is holding up fine, just fine, that's what I say. Tread the grapes, men, and rest assured." Peter patted his brother tenderly on the back to calm him. "Be still," he said to him softly. "Be still, brother. Don't shout. You're tired from your trip. Let's go home so that you can get some rest and so father can see you and quiet his heart." He took him by the hand and slowly, carefully guided his way as though he were blind. They went up the narrow street and disappeared. Old Zebedee burst into laughter. "Hey, miserable Jonah, my poor old fat fish prophet! I wouldn't want to be in your shoes for all the world." But now it was old Salome's turn to open her mouth. She still felt Andrew's large eyes hanging over her and burning her. "Zebedee," she said, shaking her white-haired head, "mind what you say, old sinner. Do not laugh. An angel stands above us and writes. You will be paid in kind for your scoffing." "Mother is right," said Jacob, who until now had kept his mouth locked. "You were within a hair's breadth of suffering the same thing with John, your pet, and as far as I can see, you're still not out of danger. He isn't helping with the vintage, so I'm told, by the carriers. He's sitting with the women and slobbering about God and fasting and immortal souls. I wouldn't want to be in your shoes either, father." He laughed dryly. He could not stomach his lazy, pampered brother and stared furiously to stamp the grapes. The blood rose to Zebedee's large head. He, in turn, could not stomach his eldest son. They resembled each other too much. A quarrel would not have broken out if at the moment Mary, the wife of Joseph of Nazareth, had not appeared at the door, leaning on John's arm. Her thin feet were bloody and covered with dust from her long journey. For days now she had abandoned her house and gone from village to village, weeping in search of her unfortunate son. God has robbed him of his senses. He had departed from the ways of men. Sighing, the mother sang her son's dirge while he was still alive. She asked everywhere if anyone had seen him. He's tall, thin, barefooted. He was wearing a blue tunic and a black leather belt. Have you noticed him, perhaps? No one had seen him, and it was only now, thanks to Zebedee's younger son, that she had got on his trail. He was at the monastery in the desert. He had donned the white robe and was prostrate, face down on the earth, praying. John, feeling sorry for her, had revealed everything. Now, leaning on his arm, she entered Zebedee's yard for a bit of rest before she set out for the desert. Old Salome rose majestically. "Welcome, Mary dear," she said. "Come inside." Mary lowered her kerchief to her brows, bowed her head, and passed through the yard with her eyes on the ground. Grasping her elderly friend's hand, she began to cry. "It's a great sin for you to cry, my child," said old Salome. She placed her on the divan and sat down by her side. "Your son is in safety now. He's under God's roof." "A mother's plan is heavy, Salome," Mary answered with a sigh. God sent me but one boy, and he a blemished one. Old Zebedee heard her complaint. He was not a bad man if one did not interfere with his profits, and came down from his platform in order to comfort her. "It's his youth, Mary," he said. "His youth. Don't worry about it. It will pass. Youth, bless it, is like wine. But we sober up soon enough and slide under the yoke without any more kicking. Your son will sober up too, Mary. Take my own son, the one you see before you. He's beginning now to get sober, glory be to God." John blushed, but did not say a word. He went inside to fetch a cup of cold water and some ripe figs to offer the visitor. The two women, sitting side by side, their heads touching, talked about the boy who had been swept away by God. They conversed in whispers so that the men would not hear them, and by interfering spoil the deep feminine joy given them by pain. "He prays and prays, your son tells me, Salome. He prostrates himself so much his hands and knees have become all calloused. John says also that he doesn't eat, and he's melting away. He's begun to see things in the air, too. It seems he even refuses to drink water in order to see the angels. Where can this affliction lead, Salome? Not even his uncle the rabbi can heal him, and think how many other people possessed with devils he has cured. Why has God cursed me, Salome? What have I done to him?" She leaned her head against the elderly friend's knees and began to weep. John appeared with a brass cup filled with water and 5 or 6 figs on a fig leaf. "Don't cry," he said to her, placing the figs in her lap. "A holy glimmer runs around your son's entire face. Not everyone sees it, but one night I did. I saw it licking his face and devouring it, and I was frightened. And after the abbot died, Father Habakkuk dreamed of him every night. He says he held your son by the hand and took him from cell to cell, pointing to him with his outstretched finger, not speaking, just smiling and pointing to him. Finally, Father Habakkuk jumped out of bed in terror and roused the other monks. They struggled all together to disentangle the dream. What did the abbot wish to tell him? Why did he point to their new guest and smile? Suddenly, the day before yesterday, the day I left, the monks were illumined by God, and they untangled the dream. The dead man was instructing them to make your son abbot. Without losing a moment, the whole monastery, full of monks, went and found your son. They fell at his feet and shouted that it was God's will he should become abbot of the monastery. But your son refused. 'No, no, this is not my road,' he said. 'I am unworthy. I shall leave.' I heard his cries of refusal at noon, just as I left the monastery. The monks were threatening to lock him into a cell and place sentries in front of the door to prevent his escape." "Congratulations, Mary," said old Salome, her aged face gleaming. "Fortunate mother, God blew into your womb, and you don't even realize it." The woman loved by God heard and shook her head, unconsoled. "I don't want my son to be a saint," she murmured. "I want him to be a man like all the rest. I want him to marry and give me grandchildren. That is God's way." "That is man's way," said John softly, as though ashamed to offer an objection. "The other is God's way, the one your son is following." They heard voices and laughter from the direction of the vineyards. Two young flush carriers entered the yard. "Bad newses, bosses," they shouted, splitting with laughter. "It looks like Magdala's risen up. The people have taken stones and are hunting their mermaid in order to kill her."